Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started. So I have a question for Summer. Since you were looking at the impact of these community news sites, and you were finding differences in terms of what actually was the news that they were providing to the community, what do you find based on your research in terms of where community news sites should be at this point? Like, what are some of the things that they need to start thinking more about in terms of the questions of how they can be covering their community in a different way?
I think one of the first things they need to start thinking about is the inclusion of interactivity, right? But we see the same thing with mainstream media. Somebody even mentioned it today that one of the things that we've seen is that people just take the print version and just put it online, right? So community news is struggling with that same issue. But I think that the real thing is trying to understand what their role is. You know, in academia, we always talk about, oh, the community news is supposed to be doing X, Y, Z, but then what? Less than 40% of the content actually was doing that X, Y, Z that community news is supposed to be doing. So are they just trying to fill that local niche that mainstream media aren't covering, right? That they're just going to be covering local news in the same way that mainstream media are doing it? Or are they actually trying to provide something a little bit different? And I think that that's, I mean, from my perspective, that's what I would like to see happen. I would like them actually try to do something a little bit different, to try and actually uphold that civic engagement criterion that makes community news different than just a local version of mainstream news. Yes, local mainstream news is being, you know, just slashed, cut back on, but at the same time, those people in the community have an advantage, right? They're part of that community. They can cover it in new and different and potentially better ways. And everybody's talking about democracy and how journalism is supposed to be there to make democracy better and to strengthen democracy, which means participation. And so the community news needs to be doing something that's going to get people to participate. And if they're just covering the news the same way that mainstream media are covering it, then I question whether or not that participation element's actually going to be there.
You were mentioning about them moving in the direction of interactivity and innovation. What would some of those examples be based on the research that you did?
Well, let me tell you, because I skipped right over that. But there were 8, well, the Michelle's List survey had a whole bunch of different interactivity features, and we collapsed those into 8 features, which are providing comments or discussion forums, the ability to upload content or submit news tips, staff contact information, social network integration, polls or voting, newsletter, somebody's talking about newsletters today, right? Calls to action, and contests. And really, these seem like very basic features, right? That we're not talking about, oh, let's open up the newsroom entirely and let them report from. You know, this isn't alternative media per se. But even still, these very basic features, they're only just doing the bare minimum.
And as you mentioned, it may also be an aspect of resources.
Resources,
right?
absolutely.
When you only have a few people or just yourself, it could be difficult in terms of trying to do everything under the sun.
It's impossible, and we see that, right? That it's the low-income earning sites that had the least amount of interactivity.
Question for you, Kyser. So when we look at solutions journalism, there has been somewhat of a stigma on the term and it being implemented in the industry. Where are we at right now in terms of looking at that notion? And based on the research you've been doing, are journalists becoming more acclimated to it, and managers and editors and publishers, or is there still ways to go in terms of the evolution of where solutions journalism can be?
Oh, absolutely. It's been growing a lot recently. The Solutions Journalism Network held their inaugural Solutions Journalism Summit in November in just outside Salt Lake City, and I got to go, and it was a lot of journalists who were learning about it and getting excited about it and taking it back to their newsrooms. But past that, there were journalists who came in with examples of what they've been doing. The network also has a story tracker that has, I think, like 3,000? Oh my gosh, 3,000 stories now that they've identified as solutions oriented. So it's starting to catch hold, and I think it's because it's, again, it's not anything new. It's just kind of putting a label to something and sort of saying, don't forget to add this part to your reporting. And yeah.
How do you see the next step, as you mentioned, as one of the journalists identified as going from investigative journalism to solutions journalism? Do you see that as the next pattern of what might be happening with solutions journalism?
Yeah, I absolutely think so, because it doesn't mean you stop reporting about the problem. The problem still exists, but you're just taking that extra step to see what's happening about it. And I think, in a sense, the people that really started this on the professional side saw a problem in journalism and tried to see, well, what can be done about that, about all this negative reporting, or just reporting on the issues. And I think when they saw that audiences really engaged with it more and identified with it more, that it kind of got it taking off.
Jeremy, next question for you.
Ready?
I'm hitting them with questions.
Yeah.
We'll come back and do an overall theme that ties everyone together. Jeremy, for yours in particular, I was really curious to know, you were mentioning that the journalists, if their management felt tied into the metrics, that they would also be bought into that as well. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So did you have a chance to find out if they were a part of the strategy from the get-go? And how are the journalists a part of that from the start in terms of bringing them in at the beginning? And how do they get a chance to be a part of what is measured and how it's measured?
Right. We didn't look at, as far as like a timeline goes, of when they're brought into the conversation, but in the responses, the written responses that we received, there was a real desire to, they felt well out of the loop, which I think some of the answers alluded to in the presentation, but there was also a desire to get in sooner and know more what's moving ahead, what the plan is and what the strategy is and how that will affect them in the newsroom. And so we didn't ask that direct question in the survey, you got that sense in the qualitative open-ended responses.
And in terms of the metrics, you were talking about attention.
Mm-hmm.
What are the ways in which attention, you brought up some basic aspects of it,
Mm-hmm.
of the metrics of attention, but can you elaborate on that? And also, what should that depth of attention be?
Mm-hmm. So in the survey instrument, we defined attention as the audience end, so to speak. So how are they engaging in news? And so that attention was related to page views and retweets and sharing, social sharing. And certainly now there's other ways that the audience engages with news stories, comments. I know we saw some presentations this morning about journalists interacting with their audience more often. So there's still a lot more work, I think, that needs to be done, looking at the many different ways that journalists are going to interact with their audience. Ours was a fairly baseline level, but I think it did open the door to some more opportunities. It's looking at some way newer journalism tools are being used to have a communication between the reporters and the audience.
What would some of those tools be?
For measurement, or I would, for instance, I would think that we saw the solution this morning. I'm forgetting the name of it. Forgive me, but where the writers dedicate about half their time to interacting with the audience, and that is part of the job, as was mentioned. But that might be a tool where instead of just looking at I replied to 10 readers today, I replied to 10 readers, but here's what I said, and here's what was discussed, and here's suggestions and takeaways from that. So maybe something a little more qualitative, but we also have to be realistic and understand that there still is the job of the journalist to report the news, and that's a big job. And so they just got to strike the right balance and find the right tools to continue to develop the metrics.
It was brought up this morning in the first panel about looking at potential thoughts and ideas and perspectives around monetization, but also compensation, in particular compensation for journalists. And should we be looking at if a story has a particular impact or less of an impact, how much does that play a part in the compensation for the journalist? Based on the research that you had done, where you're going, how do you see that falling into the mix of this too with the metrics? And that big Pandora's box.
Yeah, it's dicey for sure. I think as our survey and our research pointed out, that it's a matter of getting folks on the same page from all all the hierarchies of the influencers that we discussed, you know, from the top of the news organization, you know, right on down into every element, because you know, you have to be very certain, and we're not certain right now of just what all the metrics are measuring, you know, if those metrics are even true with everything that's happening online these days. And, you know, and also just the mission of the journalists and the mission of a particular news outlet. So that is a Pandora's box, and it's tricky terrain, but, you know, something that's worth developing and worth researching.
So going back to the theme of our issue that Dr. Jane Singer had, for habits of thought, how, this is for the whole panel, how do you see your particular perspective of the research that you've embarked on and you're moving forward to, in terms of how is this changing the way in which the publishers, editors, and reporters are now approaching their work? Do you think there is a change in their mindset, or what are those triggers that might be making those moments of a different thought process than before? I'll start with you, Kyser.
Well, I actually remembered an example that I should have brought up earlier, but there's a newspaper in Alabama, the Montgomery Advertiser, and they recently asked themselves the question, what would happen if we weren't, I can't remember the exact quote. They basically asked themselves, what happened if we weren't going to be the newspaper of record anymore? What would that free us up to be able to do? And so they brainstormed, you know, if this wasn't our priority, what then could we do? And in that session, solutions journalism became a major component of, like, well, that would free us up to maybe do this more. And so they did a whole overhaul with their newspaper, which just started about a month ago, where they tried to increase the solutions focus. And so that brought all that discussion into the newsroom when they're planning their stories and when you know, they're deciding coverage and stuff. And so going back to the fact that it all starts when you're planning the stories, and seeing that kind of mindset shift going into how you approach a topic. And so instead of, again, seeing what the issues are, you start getting that habit of thinking, well, let's get out there and see what people are doing about it. And that's kind of the biggest, I guess, shift in the thought process that we've seen.
I think that for online community news, and that this kind of corresponds with other research I've done on independent online news sites in Latin America, is that what is being rethought tends to be related to the funding sides, right? Because from the content analysis I've done, surveys, interviews, and focus groups with you and others, we seem to be seeing is that when they think about innovation, whether it's in terms of content or technology, oftentimes they're tying that to resources. And that as much as they talk a big game about wanting to be as innovative as possible, I think that really is going to be limited in terms of what they're doing innovatively with their funding. And so I think that's why we're also starting to see so many of these different multiple revenue streams, right? The contests, the subscription models, the membership models, donations, events. El Salvador just had their big, or they're about to have, did they just have it? Their big Central American Journalism Forum, right? So that's a moneymaker. T-shirts, mugs, things that NPR might have known for a while, right? But the other regular news, I shouldn't say regular, but other news outlets haven't necessarily thought about journalism in those terms before. And so now I think that having to rethink financing has made journalists and journalist outlets rethink everything from, top to bottom.
I would say in terms of mindset, just from the survey responses from the journalists, they are willing and definitely capable of producing quality journalism, and they still have place great emphasis on the quality of the news. But you do sense a little bit of innovation fatigue to some degree. And I still think they appreciate it and they like it, but there's just there's a constant trying, failing, trying, and that instability based on the responses seem to be rather prevalent. And so it's a tough business. It's we're trying to find new ways to fund it and to while at the same time produce quality work. And so I do think the emphasis that they placed on the quality that they want to continue to produce gives you a good sense that they are willing to be patient with these innovations and with these challenges. I think that's a good thing. I think it's a positive result.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you think about, marching forward quickly or marching slowly and identifying risks along the way. And I think there's both advantages to both approaches, right, in both cases. And I think we see a lot of those experiments happening now in a lot of different parts of the world with many different news organizations. So I think, hopefully out of this panel, we've created more questions than answers, hopefully. And so we're going to go ahead and give our panelists a big round of applause for their time.